And now with this, I would like to invite our panelists, Alex, Eric, and Stefan. Can you join the stage? Let's give an applause to our panelists. Yeah. All right. So can we have the panelists on the screen also? So I would like to kick this off with asking Alex, like, okay, please introduce yourself and tell us what are you seeing in the world, and maybe especially in the finance sector, and how do you review the VC landscape for the next 10 years?
Good morning, everyone. My name's Alex Cubbage. I'm a partner at Silverstripe, based in London. We are the European arm of a significant US family office that's made all its money in financial services over the last 25 years. We've built a number of major banks, both in the US and in the UK. So our focus is predominantly fintech, financial services. It's always difficult to predict the future, but I think what we can say is it's going to be unprecedented over the next kind of 10 years. We can sit here and talk about AI, we can talk about investment in space tech and satellites, we can talk about climate tech and all the major developments happening there. One of the things that we really kind of pay kind of close attention to is the world is getting older and people are living a lot longer. And that has major implications for taxation policies with governments around the world, the ability for governments to financially support their economies. And you know, when I was sitting in 2020, just before the pandemic, I was sitting with a good friend of mine who runs his own family office out of Sydney. We were sitting there and said, and I just read this book on major financial crises over the last kind of 100 years. And we determined that the next major crisis was not going to be financial, it was going to be social. And that was mainly driven by what we saw as the wealth divide or the wage gap, or however you want to phrase it. And that was pre-pandemic, before we printed money again, which has only, I think, made the problem even worse. So when we look at where the world's problems are going to come from, I sat there during the pandemic, and yes, everyone's talking about AI now today, and because ChatGPT, but look, the developments have been going on for the last decade, and whether you want to call it automation, machine learning onto AI, etc. But we sat there and went, okay, well, if I lose, my generation, if we lose our job at 50, am I going to get another job again? And I kind of thought, no, I'm not. And unfortunately, in the Western world, we are not great at taking a long-term view in terms of sustainably training our economy. So we basically look at financial services as how can we actually solve problems, because we don't think the governments have the money in the world to solve them. So one of the key things we've been looking at is actually how do we get people onto the asset ladder? So how do we get people onto the housing ladder? How do we get people investing into financial assets to create their own wealth? So that's been a huge focus of ours, and we think those opportunities are only getting better because of things like AI and automation. But the real thing that, if I was to come back to what excites me over the kind of near term is, and I'm probably going to not make any friends here with this comment, but I think venture and private equity is broken. And I think it's broken because it's become commoditized, because we have printed money globally for 13 years. And we have dramatically shifted the capital flows from the public markets to the private markets. And I think what's happened is, if you take a step back, is, these funds have just got bigger and bigger and bigger, particularly in the US. And they've gone from trying to spot the winners and fund the best founders to funding the second, the third, the fourth. And we've now got this situation where I think we're only starting to see the fall in venture values. And if you were to look at the last kind of 5 years in particular, but maybe going back over the last 10 years, I don't think alpha has been rewarded, I think it's been, funds have got bigger and allocators have just gone to the brand names, etc. And personally, we think there's a huge opportunity now if you are a small, focused, specialized fund that has a very intelligent kind of micro theme where you are looking at the impacts of aging population, advancements in technology, and where you can bring real operational support to those companies, we think you could do incredibly well.
Yeah, controversial and great comments. Thank you. Maybe here is a good time for have Stefan to tell us about what countries are thinking about and where is the money actually is coming from, maybe to the markets in the next few years. So maybe you can introduce yourself and tell us what you are seeing in the world.
Yes, thank you, Markus. So, Stefan, I work now as the first ambassador of technology for the Finnish Foreign Service, and you might, of course, ask, what on earth is that? It means, of course, that whatever happens in the tech world today affects foreign and security policy more than ever. It affects foreign and security policy above all, but also human rights, trade policies and standards. And standards are now foreign and security policy. But I'm speaking here also as an investor. I'm an LP in 5 funds, yes, among them. So I'm looking at it sort of holistically a little bit from the above and what are the mega trends that are actually affecting the investment flows all over the world in different ways. And there are a couple of big trends, I would say. What you said was really resonating in a lot of issues, but I'm adding on a little bit on that. First of all, I'm introducing a new thing. Everybody's familiar with ESG, right? I'm going to introduce ESG 2.0 to you. ESG for me stands for energy, security and geopolitics. So a totally different concept in a sense, because that's what's affecting everything more than the sort of traditional ESG 1 in many different ways. And the flow here is really interesting, because when you also look at what's happening in the world today is that previously for the last 20 years, well actually 50 years I could say, it's been that economy has been driving politics. But now politics is driving the economy. And let me elaborate a little bit of how I see that. When you look at what's happening in the world today is that you have issues like the RRF, the recovery funds after COVID. You talk about 600-700 billion coming into the economy in the world. You talk about the bipartisan infra act in the US. You talk about the CHIPS Act in the EU and in the US, that's $100 billion. I can go on forever on these issues, but I made a brief calculation about $2,500 billion are coming into the funds. And it's taxpayers' money. It's totally unprecedented when you look at it from the last, since the Second World War, really, in what's happening. And you also have the situation that where are this money going? It's primarily the green transition all over the world, everywhere. And green transition is, green transition is not possible without digital. So these are the mega trends in a way of where we are heading on these issues. And the green transition is bringing so much more into it because it affects politics wherever you go. So we are again going back sort of that the politics drive the economy, and then the economy that is being driven by the politics is going to go back and drive politics. And we see that everywhere, and it's not an easy thing. You mentioned aging, but there is also another thing that is there, and that's the continuous education on tech, what you also mentioned, because there's so many people falling behind, in between the cracks. And we can see these people who think that they think in a way that democracy is not supporting or understanding their values, their way of life. And they want to sit in the backyard and grill their meat and drink their beer, and nobody protects them. And that's why you have people like Trump coming up and saying, that I speak for you. But the real reason is really technology, because technology is going so fast forward. And everybody has to run so fast today to even stay in place. So there comes this continuous education thing that is really, really important. And how do we do this? I mean, I call these people analog people. But you can see them in the Finnish political system, in the Swedish, in the American, in the British. I can go on forever on these issues, as you know.
I have so many follow-up questions, but let's give the turn to Eric, and please introduce yourself and tell us what you are seeing in the world, maybe about climate and green transition, and what's important to you?
Sure. Thanks, Marcus. So I'm a fellow at Stanford University and specialist on industrial decarbonization. I've also worked for the past few years with an investment fund called Breakthrough Energy Ventures, which is a $2.5 billion clean tech investment fund that invests in exactly what we're talking about here, the green transition. And when I hear what we're talking about, I think the most prominent thing that I'm seeing that could be interesting for investors and is interesting for me and for everyone is the massive global opportunity that clean tech and climate tech implies for everyone. And when you look at the scale of investment that's needed globally, so when you talk about energy or when you talk about heavy industrial processes, you're not just talking about tens of millions, hundreds of millions, or even billions. You're talking about trillions of dollars that need to go in a combination of equity investment, venture investment, private equity investment, infrastructure investment, and to rebuild an entire infrastructure of the world from massive CO2 production to clean tech will involve trillions and trillions of dollars of spending. And when you look at this and you look at the current economic situation in the world, this is a sector that's operating completely independently of what's happening in the world. You have a whole economic scenario where there's all kinds of risks, collapsing prices in venture companies, et cetera. And then you have a whole other section of the world where between the EU and the US, there's trillions of dollars of government commitments to invest in this technology. And there's also growing probably tens or hundreds of billions of dollars of venture investments going in and fundamental new technologies that are being brought to the market now. So it's, in my opinion, the most important investment opportunity of, I think, my lifetime. I think it's also one of the most engaging ones because it's at the same time a huge economic opportunity, a huge security improvement opportunity too when you look at the electrification of Europe instead of the dependence on natural gas or things like that. And it also attracts the top talent, at least in the US and Europe where I'm usually working. All the top talent wants to move into this area because they find that's a combination of economic opportunity and social opportunity to help the world, and to really help what's happening. So for me, that's the most prominent economic trend that I'm motivated by. Everyone I work with is motivated by, and I think is the huge investment opportunity. In general, I've almost never been to any conference that's not a clean tech or climate tech conference, but this, I'm glad to participate here. But I encourage everyone to think about your own investment opportunity in this area, and how you can take advantage of that and participate to that and help with this type of investment. So.
Thank you. Very interesting points. Maybe I actually want to hear comments on all of you. Like, how are you thinking about the crossroad of this slowdown in funding, but at the same time, this rise of massive investment for these things? And also, how do you review like US and Europe and opportunities here? So maybe Alex, any thoughts on this moment in time, slowing down? Maybe you said that it's VC working, but at the same time, we hear that it's going to be funding. And also, how are you looking at Europe and US? How do you compare these?
So whilst most of our money comes from the US, we've pretty much a sole focus on Europe. For us, look, I've been on the road for about 8-9 months now and kind of gone around the world. We're actually taking in outside capital for the first time, so going meeting families that we know around the world. And what's pretty evident is 2 years ago, they felt pretty wealthy. And they looked at their private equity allocations, and they thought they were 5, 8, 10x up. And then you go meet them now, and they're like, we haven't had a distribution for 12 months, and our GPs are telling us we don't expect anything in 2023, which, and I think if you play that all the way through to pension funds, you are going to see a rebalance of capital away from private markets. That gets us excited because we can get in at good entry bases and try to add value.
Yeah.
And I think we try and where we always look at is where can we put money to work where we can build businesses where there's a plethora of capital later on to take those companies on. So it's actually really interesting with the climate tech side. So one of the areas we've been very focused on in the UK is, we looked at what's the cost of retrofitting every home in the UK to kind of EPCC, not even net carbon neutral.
Actually, sorry, I have to give others also the commentary. Our time seems to be running out, so this is like a big topic. We could be here all day, but maybe you could also comment and then Eric, and so please go ahead, Stefan, and maybe we can close down the session after this.
I'm approaching it from a little bit different angle in a sense, because where is the US, Europe? Europe has to realize sooner or later that we don't have any commodities in Europe. We are depending on it from every single, in every single sense, and we need to build a kind of internal resilience in many different ways. EU is a wonderful institution in many ways, but it needs to reshape and reorganize itself so that we get it working in a way that it's supposed to be working. We have a gigantic internal market, but we are not utilizing it in any sense at this moment. And we should really work on those issues, also on the research side. And we are slowly getting into being able to scale up in the same way as they do in the US, but we are still way behind. We have seen our first sort of $100 billion unicorns coming up from here as well. So we have the technology, that's another issue about it. It's about how we deal with it in many different ways. Another thing is the diversity issue, which I would like to bring up. If you want to see what diversity means, go to the campus of Stanford or UCLA. And that's where you have sort of a mix of race, of people, of age, of everything that is churned into one gigantic pot. And then that's where innovation comes from. And that's what we need to do in Europe as well in many different ways. Last thing what I would like to raise is also the issue about connectivity. What's happening on the 5G market today is sort of democratizing the world in a way that has never been seen before. And I maintain that connectivity is going to be the next globalization. Globalization meant that in the last 20 years we were able to bring about 1 billion people out of poverty into the sort of lower middle class and middle class. And connectivity is going to do the next, is going to be have the same impact on all these issues. And when you combine connectivity with a green approach, that's where we are going to see the biggest impact, I think.
Thank you. And Eric, the final commentary. We are all investors here. So about these topics, but where should we look also? Maybe you can add that from your part of expertise. So, yeah.
Where should investors look?
Yes. Which topics, and bring it to your house also. But also comment on the Europe, US a little bit.
Sure. So in Europe, in US, in clean and climate tech, until very recently, I would say Europe was 15 or 20 years ahead in most of these topics, especially heavy industrial decarbonization, which is the area I look at. Enormous opportunities here because for the last 15 or 20 years, corporates have been pursuing decarbonization and governments have been helping to facilitate that, the EU ETS, cap and trade, et cetera. A year or two ago, now the US is not only a player, but has, tripled or quadrupled or, 10x down on green hydrogen or other vectors of decarbonization, to the tune that European companies and technology companies are looking, to go potentially to the US to take advantage of those government aids and subsidies. So I think it's awesome. It's a healthy competition. This is what we want. And that's perfect for investors and technologies that want to grow. And then where can investors look? There's so many incredible opportunities in the sector. It depends on the type of investor. So if we're talking about investors that are looking to, I think I would classify the two huge opportunities are technology, direct investment into new technologies, and then a direct investment into the deployment of new technologies through infrastructure capital. And I'm assuming here probably it's the new technologies that are more interesting. There are so many new companies and new funds that are looking at decarbonization technology. It's really, I would say the most interesting opportunities now are no longer just in renewables or things that everyone knows about, but they're in decarbonization of cement, steel, decarbonization, the electrification of heavy industrial processes. There are some digital clean tech investments also that are very interesting. But those sectors are new enough that the low-hanging fruit is still there, and governments are stepping in to provide a lot of the incentives for deployment of those technologies. So getting in early stage to those decarbonization technologies and figuring out, if cement produces 8% of all the CO2 in the world, 2 or 3 years ago, people didn't even know what cement is made out of. Probably most people here don't, but investors, clean tech investors do. There's probably 75 companies working on decarbonizing cement, at least now, that are funded by venture investors. So, this is going to be the next wave of clean tech, not just deployment of solar and wind and things like that you've heard of, but, how do you make cement completely without using CO2 and without emitting CO2 in that process? Or how do you decarbonize steel through direct reduction or things like that? So this is where I think the big opportunities are.
So with this, I think we went over time, but it was the last inspiring words. And these experts are here the whole day, I think so. So please come and have a chat with these guys.